Well, good morning. My name is Jason Wager. I'm a planner at Central Iowa Regional Council and coordinator for the Central Iowa Clean Fuels Coalition. Thank you for joining us today. Really quickly, before we get into the topic, I wanted to provide a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, we do have a question and answer function, and would ask that you use that. If we don't get to all questions today, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. And also, just as a practical item, we'll try to have each speaker turn things over to the next speaker so that we don't have lots of back and forth with moderator and so forth. But I do appreciate the chance to serve as moderator today with this conversation. We think it's a very important and timely one. So first, thanks to my fellow Clean Cities Coalition coordinators in North Carolina, and we'll share a little bit more about those in just a minute. And also, of course, thanks to Advanced Energy and the Plug-in North Carolina, the Plug-in NC program. And of course, thanks to our presenters and longtime partners at Duke Energy for sharing their perspectives today. As you know, you signed up, but today concludes with the third webinar in our series on transportation electrification in the medium and heavy duty sectors, titled a Utilities Perspective webinar, Planning, Development, and Lessons Learned from Medium and Heavy Duty Vehicle Electrification. I guess I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists and let you know a little bit about who we have with us today. And then, as well, introduce our a little bit more about the Clean Cities program. So, very briefly, we have Mike Rowan. And actually, before I share more about our panelists, I want to mention that we will have full bios and a summary with today's summary that will be shared in a webinar recap following today. So, in case you want to read a little bit more about who we have, that will be available to you. So with us today are Mike Rowan, the Director of Technology Development for Duke Energy. He is responsible for technology evaluation and development with a focus on electric transportation and related distributed energy resources, including energy storage, demand-side management, distributed generation, and other end-use energy systems and devices. With a degree from University of Florida in mechanical engineering, he is a licensed professional engineer in North Carolina and South Carolina and a certified energy manager. And on a personal note, I'll say he is probably one of the first people I ever ran into in the EV realm, getting started way back in the mid-2000s, as this whole topic really kicked up in our area. So glad to have him here today. Also with him is Jim Polk, and Jim will talk a little bit more about current initiatives and highlight successful collaborations and case studies from the Duke Service energy territories. Jim, in 2006, created Plug-in North Carolina, or Plug-in Carolina, excuse me, the Carolina's first plug-in vehicle advocacy organization. And then after many different activities, and again, ran into Jim back in the early days, as many of us on this call partnered on the state's first, North Carolina's first plug-in EV, or plug-in readiness program and plan for the state. Really got to know Jim during that time from the 2011 to 2013 timeframe. And in the interim, as things have progressed, Jim has now found his way to joining Duke Energy as an electric transportation manager for South Carolina. In this role, he is helping to deploy all things electric in the transportation sector, and is a graduate from the University of South Carolina. Lives in Charleston with his wife, 2 boys, dog, cat, and a red Chevy Volt that he has driven over 242,000 miles. So he has definitely been on the road. And then here in a minute, I will pass things over to Jacob Boland, who's a project manager at Advanced Energy. His work focuses on overseeing Plug-in NC, a statewide program that promotes electric vehicles across North Carolina through education, outreach, and resource development. With a degree in industrial and systems engineering from Auburn University and living in Durham, North Carolina, Jacob is our fearless leader on the Plug-in NC side, and we really look to him often for coalescing around and coordinating statewide our EV activities here in the Carolinas, certainly in North Carolina especially. So I think what I'd like to do is briefly share some updates and information about the Clean Cities program before I turn things over to Jacob. Very, very quickly, established in 1993 following the Energy Policy Act of 92, the Clean Cities program really rose and continues to this day to be successful due to its adaptability, resiliency to things, the changing markets, technologies, and so forth. But it really was initiated and continues to foster national economic, environmental, and energy security by working locally to advance affordable domestic transportation fuels, energy-efficient mobility systems, and other fuel-saving technologies and practices. With nearly 100 coalitions across the country to serve as that foundation, Clean Cities program really is working to cut petroleum use in communities across the country, with about 82% of the total U.S. population living within one coalition boundary or another. And each coalition is led by an on-the-ground Clean Cities coordinator who tailors projects and activities to capitalize on the unique opportunities in each of their areas. And with that, I think we are seeing, just to the topic today in our area in the greater Charlotte region, and let me go ahead and share the next slide where Central Line of Clean Fuels is located. We're seeing several local examples of emerging medium and heavy-duty EV activities. These would include everything from transit buses with the MyRide system in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and CATS in Charlotte has just announced and received the funding to do a pilot program to test out several OEMs. Of course, also at the airport, we're seeing EV buses being deployed there. This is actually, something they've tried before and have learned a lot of great lessons. I think they're going to have a lot of success this go around. And then not to mention an EV school buses being announced in the recent VW settlement funds handed out through the state. And specifically Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools was able to be successful in that regard. So you can see our North Carolina coalitions, they're housed at regional councils of government, in this case in the Asheville, Charlotte, and Triangle areas. And then we, of course, work with all statewide and Southeast regional partners to assist not only our region, but the rest of the state. And I think Plug-in NC is actually the perfect venue, and why we really enjoy our partnership through Plug-in NC so much is the ability to coalesce statewide so we're not all working individually. And then last slide I'll share, Clean Cities is the technology integration arm of the Department of Energy's energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. We're fuel neutral. As I mentioned, we work to promote the Energy Policy Act, identified alternative fuels, and deploy infrastructure. We really focus on right sizing and making sure the technology and fuel mix is the right fit for fleet. So not all fuels are a great fit for all fleets. We've got to look at what you're trying to accomplish, and we think that that's very important so that there's successful experiences. And we also just help end users with understanding mobility choices, and even now we're seeing a huge growth and interest in new technologies such as micromobility, autonomous and connected vehicle technologies, and so forth. So I think at this stage in 2020, we are seeing very important need and focus on the topic today. So we're seeing all kinds of funding evolving and being made available, lots of technologies growing, policy shifts which are making medium and heavy duty vehicles even more viable in a lot of our fleets. And so with that, I'd really now like to turn things over to Jacob Boland to talk a bit more about Well, thanks, Jason. And I'll be pretty brief here as well. Just wanted to say thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. And really just want to briefly share a message about Plug-in NC and kind of what we're here to do and emphasize with those partnerships that Jason mentioned. So Plug-in NC is an outreach and education program certainly focused on advancing electric vehicle adoption and infrastructure deployment across the state. So we've been working since 2011 to kind of succeed in that mission. Obviously, there's so much going on right now in terms of momentum for the electrification of transportation. So certainly a fun time. And it's really nice to have not just Duke Energy, but all of the utilities really kind of at the table and working to advance that kind of sector growth and to be leaders, not just for the state, but really nationally as well. So we're going to have a great opportunity to hear from Duke Energy today about kind of what they've seen across their service territories and certainly kind of where that can be applied in the state of North Carolina here as well. I'll very quickly just touch on our Plug-in NC Steering Committee because I think it really highlights the public-private partnerships and collaboration that we have operating through Plug-in NC as an opportunity to really, again, progress the adoption of EVs, both in the light-duty sector and also in the medium and heavy-duty sectors. So as you can see, we have that utility engagement. We have the partnerships with the Clean Cities Coalitions, with the various station installers, ChargePoint, EVgo, and the like. And also, of course, we've got the kind of the public entities as well with NCDOT, NCDEQ, and also the Clean Energy Technology Center housed at NC State University. So really just to kind of set the stage before I hand it over to Mike to kind of share his expertise in the industry, I just kind of want to share what's been happening here in the state of North Carolina that all of you may be aware of and that we certainly highlighted in our previous two webinars of this series. Very recently, we've had the 15th State Memorandum of Understanding signed by Governor Roy Cooper. It's essentially a commitment to rapidly progressing the electrification in this sector of medium and heavy-duty vehicle types. Jason alluded to the recent VW mitigation announcements housed by NC Department of Environmental Quality. So that's going to be rapidly deploying DC fast charging infrastructure across the state, as well as providing a number of electric school and transit buses to various entities. With that, we have school bus pilots launching, whether it's in the neighboring state of Virginia with Dominion Energy's efforts. Certainly there will be a lot to learn there, and they will be using Thomas-built electric school buses, of course, manufactured here in North Carolina. Electric transit continues to expand across the state, not just with new organizations committing to electrifying their transit buses where applicable, but also a growing number of recurring transit buses. So for those entities that were maybe early adopters, we're seeing more and more bus deployments within those organizations. And that's paired very nicely with the rapidly kind of progressing efforts from municipalities, utilities, and transit agencies as they really work to shift to a more carbon-friendly and cost-friendly operating strategy with electric transit. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just set up two quick poll questions for you guys as we hand it over to Duke Energy. So the first one, what stage are you in of your electric transportation journey? We really kind of want to gauge our audience here as we think about where folks are. So I'll give you just a few seconds to read the various options and provide your responses. All right, so right off the bat, it looks like we see a really kind of diverse and kind of balanced response ratio. With it looks like the most popular option being implementing EVs and learning from the process. So that's obviously very exciting to see that playing out in real time with our audience.
in terms of the fact that we're not just at kind of the early stages of this, but we're really trying to figure out what has been working and how we can continue to iterate and improve. Great. Well, thanks for the responses. So for the next question, what are your concerns and what barriers do you see kind of as kind of a top barrier or issue for vehicle electrification? So again, just give you guys a few seconds to select kind of the top concern or barrier that you might have at this point, and certainly expect our speakers from Duke Energy today to really be able to highlight and hopefully educate around those concerns. Yeah, certainly. So we see two real big ones jumping out here, which is really pretty exciting thinking about the content of this webinar, understanding infrastructure needs and planning. Certainly that'll be a great transition over to Mike Rowan at Duke Energy, and also overcoming some of those upfront costs that we see with that kind of initial cost model that often occurs, especially kind of in the public sector. Great. Well, thanks everyone for the responses. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Mike at Duke Energy.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob and Jason. Look forward to the conversation today. From the poll questions, it looks like we have a mixture of those who are on their journey, but also there was a good many who are still trying to learn. So look forward to the conversation today. As we look at Duke Energy and fleet electrification, we are going to be talking primarily about medium and heavy duty, but we're talking about fleets in general. I wanted to start off just by an update on the Duke Energy fleet. The picture you see, every vehicle in that picture is a plug-in vehicle, as we're making plans to electrify as much of our fleet as possible. Obviously, the light-duty vehicles are much more farther along, but we have a number of pickup trucks, which at this point are upfitted vehicles, but we have pickup trucks coming to the market beginning next year. And even some of our construction equipment, like the boom truck you see, the bucket truck, that is a plug-in hybrid with all the auxiliary equipment being operated electrically. So it still drives on diesel, but once it gets to the site, the engine is turned off, no idling, and all the auxiliary and construction equipment operating of the boom and all that is done electrically. So there are a lot of options coming to the table, and at Duke, our goal is by 2030 that we will have electrified everything that is possible to electrify by that date. As we think about the medium and heavy duty vehicles, the biggest message that you need to be aware of, if you weren't already, is that they are coming. A lot of times the light duty, the passenger vehicles get a little bit more of the public attention, the media attention, with the Model 3 or Y or Cybertruck and those sorts of things. From Tesla and others. But the fleet vehicles, medium heavy duty vehicles, are on their way. The first picture there is Daimler Truck North America. Thomasville School Bus was mentioned earlier, which is a Daimler Truck company, but you have the Cascadia. The Cascadia is the largest, the best-selling Class 8 tractor in the country. An electric version of that is actually on the road in early trials today. We have people like Tesla and the Class 8 trucks. Transit buses are the most mature market in the medium heavy duty space now, and multiple, not just startups like Proterra that has a lot of facilities in the Carolinas, but the historic ones like Gillig and New Flyer and those type of companies are moving forward as well. Not only that, you have other type of vehicles. Yard tractors is a great application based on their duty cycles. Refuse trucks, other large vehicles with different models coming to the market today from different manufacturers. A lot of times when we think about electric vehicles, a lot of the attention today is in the last mile, and with the COVID situation, the last mile delivery has been focused on even more. UPS has letters of intent with a number of different manufacturers as they continue to look at their vehicles. Amazon, as you may have seen, has ordered 100,000 from Rivian, but also some other manufacturers. Interestingly, some videos started showing up just this week, the last couple of days, of the first Rivian delivery van for Amazon doing its road testing. So if you haven't seen those yet, you can do a quick online search and see the first version of that Rivian van out there. So these vehicles are coming, and in the fleet market, obviously it's a total cost of ownership, more of a spreadsheet purchase. which we see making this possible that this market will accelerate and turn over more quickly than the passenger and light duty market. Although the light duty market, the passenger vehicles are more on the road today, once the numbers show that it's more economical to drive an electric truck from a business standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, obviously the decisions to switch will be made much more quickly than in some of the consumer markets. One of the things we're noticing as we work with customers about electrification is that in the traditional liquid fuels market, the decisions around vehicle acquisition, vehicle specs, and you have others who do the fuel purchasing, or you may just, go to public gas stations. Then you may have the facility engineers, the electrical engineers, the facility engineers who look after properties. In the liquid fuels environment, those are really separate functions, and they really have no bearing with one another. Very, very little overlap, if any, between those groups and those needs based on the liquid fuels environment. However, as we move to electrification, the vehicle specs can have a tremendous impact on facilities, the charging powers, the number of vehicles, the total load requirement. The facility infrastructures are really impacted by that. The fuel purchasing, where diesel is purchased on a commodity basis, electricity is based on the electric rates. It can vary. At a macro level, electricity is a much more stable fuel price than diesel or gasoline. At a macro level, if you look, average cost from year to year, electricity is much more stable. However, at the micro level, on a daily basis or an hourly basis, depending on the rate tariff, the rate schedule that a customer is served by, prices can fluctuate much more greatly from electricity. So on one hand, electricity is less volatile, but in another sense, electricity is more volatile from a fuel price. So that in turn can impact the vehicle specs, how fast you want to charge it, which can impact fuel prices, electric prices, and that sort of thing. So one of the underlying things that needs to be realized as we look at fleet electrification is this integration of the vehicle specs and the interdependencies, which we will talk a little bit more about as we go through the presentation. One of the other things we find is that, especially in fleet environment, people are not used to talking in electric terms. Obviously, from a gasoline, you're looking at gallons and different things like that, or even if you're familiar with the BTUs and different energy metrics in the diesel and gasoline world, people are not used to talking in terms of kilowatts and kilowatt hours. And what does that intuitively mean? We easily understand what a gallon of gas looks like and what it means. But if somebody says, all right, you need this many kilowatts of charging power or this many kilowatt hours of batteries, there's a lack of that intuitive understanding in the market. And so one of the things that's important is an education process. And in this slide, which talks about the different charging levels, from a level 1 120 volt outlet that may be in your garage to the extreme high powers, megawatt level power charging that is coming. The column on the right can often help people understand that. If you're talking about plugging into an outlet at home at level 1 at 1.4 kW, that's like a hairdryer. It's just a hairdryer that's plugged in for 8 hours instead of 5 minutes. Level 2, which can go up to 19 kW, but typically is in the 3 to 6 or 7 kW range. That's equivalent to a clothes dryer or a water heater. But as we get into the larger vehicles, and as you get into the traditional DC fast charging that's in the 50 to 350 kW range, a vehicle charging at that rate is using the power, the kilowatts of maybe a small office building, a multi 3 to 4 story office building, a medical plaza or something like that. As we get into the larger vehicles, the heavy-duty vehicles, which the standards are being worked on as we speak for megawatt level charging, one vehicle may consume the same amount of power as a 20-story office building or a large retail mega center. And therefore, that understanding that infrastructure is a key part of the electrification process, and really iterates the previous slide that you can't speak about the vehicle electrification in isolation from the facility planning. So as we think about those infrastructure considerations, I like using the iceberg analogy. And from an iceberg standpoint, there's the little bit that you see, but there's a lot under the water. And as people think about electrical infrastructure, frequently they just think of the charging station. Oh, I need to buy a charging station. I need to get charging stations as I get electric vehicles. Really, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's the most visible part. That's the part you think of as you actually be plugging into a vehicle. But as with an iceberg, that's just the tip. That's just part of what needs to be considered for infrastructure. As you get below the water surface, you have the facility electrical infrastructure, the upgrades that may be needed to switchgear or internal transformers and conduit and busway and those sorts of things. On the utility side of the meter, so in the Carolinas, if you're served by Duke, maybe as you start electrification, it's not a big deal. But if you got a large electrification project, we may need to upgrade your substation or the service to your facility. Or as electrification continues, maybe there's some off-site reconductoring lines or increasing the capacity of the utility lines to ensure there is adequate service for the or fleet electrification. And then finally, distributed energy resources. Depending on the rate tariff, there may be reasons for energy storage or renewables. These could come into play based on someone's sustainability goals, emission reduction goals, or from electric cost standpoint, it may be a way of managing the electric rates as you're looking at it. It could be a way to manage those capacity requirements. And also from a resiliency standpoint, now that you can't just pull up to a gas station or you may not have a gas pump on site, what do you do if there's an extended outage? Do you need any distributed resources to help from a resiliency standpoint? So one of the things to think about from the infrastructure standpoint is the tip of the iceberg is really that charging station that you think about, but there is a lot that needs to go on behind the scenes that requires appropriate planning. So as we look at this, all these become interdependent. The total cost of ownership is something that is a primary metric for fleets. But as we look at the different components of electrification, the vehicle specs can impact that TCO. The vehicle specs can impact the site operations. Do you have all night to recharge, or do you have just a few hours to recharge? Are you doing a one-shift or two-shift operations? That can change the battery size requirements. That can change the charging power requirements, which then it can impact the rate tariff implications of your fuel costs and your facility upgrades and utility upgrades and fuel supply. So all these things interact, especially the yellow point there in terms of future optionality. We're still early in the process, and as fleets move from a few vehicle pilots to full electrification, that the thought needs to be put there for how do I ensure that what I'm doing in the early stages is not going to be a stranded asset, or I don't want to tear out equipment that I use for my pilot to use for full electrification. So how do you design the program so that you can have some future optionality as the technology continues to change? One to step through is finally 10 things to consider, which is from the EEI, Edison Electric Institute, put these out. But in context of our fleet discussion, I wanted to walk through these very quickly. You can get more information on this from the EEI website. But I think that the 10 thoughts that are included in this work, I think, are very helpful in this process. Number one, engage with the electric utility early and often. The things I talked about earlier about the integration of utility infrastructure with customer infrastructure with fleet requirements. The earlier you can engage with your electric supplier, the better, to ensure there's no barriers or timeline impacts to the electrification process. How do you choose the right use cases to minimize costs, especially in these early going? All vehicles will not work for all applications. So how do you start with the right use cases so that you're optimizing the vehicle to the use case so you can minimize costs, both from a vehicle standpoint and an infrastructure standpoint? Electricity is delivered in real time. We may intuitively understand that, but what does that mean from a practical standpoint? Unlike liquid fuels, there's not a storage tank, at least not yet. Energy storage, hopefully we'll get to that point. But because electricity is in real time, how does that impact some of the things we've talked about in terms of fuel prices and backup and contingency applications? Electric costs depend on how charging is done. One vehicle, the same vehicle, can be charged very quickly or very slowly. In gasoline, you know, the gas price doesn't change based on how many gallons per minute the pump can put out. But on the electric side, your cost can vary based on how fast you're consuming that electricity to charge vehicles. Working with that electric utility to get your facility ready, that's part of number one as well. But that coordination is needed to ensure the utility side infrastructure improvements are coordinated with the facility side improvements. The sixth one, plan charging strategy before buying the EV. This is crucial. Sometimes people buy an EV and then start thinking about charging. Because of all the interdependencies we've spoken about, that can really back you into a corner in terms of some of the requirements. In addition, especially as production start ramping up from the automakers and the vehicle manufacturers, the lead time on infrastructure very well may be longer than the lead time for electric or the vehicle itself. So you may buy a vehicle and the vehicle is going to arrive next month, so you start thinking about the infrastructure. Well, it may take 6-8 months for the infrastructure to be ready. So it's something to think about. Plan that charging strategy before buying the EV, both from a practical site prep standpoint, but also a timeline. Line the charging solutions with the needs, back to the different power levels, how to, AC versus DC, the different levels we spoke about. I want to charge as fast as I need, but not faster than I need. So some things to think about. The collaboration, the cooperation between fleet and facilities personnel, which we mentioned earlier, is very important. Electricity means the fuel is thinking about fuel availability in different ways. Again, the storage is not quite there yet. What do I do in an outage? What are my contingency plans if I have a long-term outage and it may impact my operation? What do I need to do? So just thinking about electricity differently as a fuel. And there are multiple options to manage costs. Because of the interdependencies that we spoke of earlier, the the vehicle specifications can impact your costs. The charging plans can impact your costs. The rate tariff applications can impact your costs. So in one sense, that creates a little bit maybe more complexity or uncertainty and maybe a little bit scary at first. However, on the flip side, it does create multiple ways to manage the cost. You're not locked into one specific manner, so that there are ways to mix and match and look at different options to manage the cost. So look forward to the continued conversations. Jim's going to pick up now with some of the implications that we've seen on some of these things within the Duke territory, and look forward to the questions and answers afterwards. Jim?
Great. Mike, thanks so much for that presentation. We really appreciate it. My name is Jim Polk, a Duke Energy Electric Transportation Manager. And like you, I've attended many of these webinars, and the presenters correctly share the opportunities and benefits. And like me, they're a big advocate for transportation electrification. But what Mike and I were thinking about, hey, what about when things don't go perfectly right? What is some of the most valuable information? And he and I, and he's been out there a lot more than I, but we've been out in the field, both with our customers and outside customers, gone to conferences and the like, and we found that there are a lot of lessons learned. And there's a lot of things that you can plan and a lot of things you can avoid. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, we are going to do a poll question. And the first question is, according to the organization CalSTART, as of October 2019, how many electric buses were in operation within the U.S.? So that's transit, all types of electric buses, whether it's transit, school, shuttle. What do we think? Give just a few more minutes. How about a few more answers? Okay. All right, and the answer is 2,255 according to CalSTAR, which is really interesting. Second poll question to give us some perspective is, according to the organization Securing America's Future Energy, as of September 2020, how many electric buses are in operation in China? Let's see what kind of answers we have here. 20,000, 99,000, 100,000, 250,000. Oh, 1 million. It's not 1 million. I can say that. Okay. The answer is 421,000. Gives us kind of some perspective there. And that's what leads me to a gentleman named Raymond Nallo. He's a maintenance manager in Twin Rivers District, California, who operates 30 electric buses and 115 bus fleet. He was quoted in an article about a conference, Zero Emission Bus Conference, hosted by Center for Transportation and Environment. And what he said is, looking at this difference, don't be afraid to take the plunge. There's so many new technologies out there, you can find what works for you. Now, we agree with Raymond's assessment, but we say before you take the plunge, just do a little bit of planning. And here are four, high-level categories that we can talk about what you should be, really thinking about and asking questions. Charge management. Pay close attention to charge management. It may be one of the most important things that you can do. It's where we hear where some of the pain is taking place with early adopters. With early pilots, small pilots, 1 or 2 vehicles, it's typically very manageable. And even if you run into any problems, you can usually have, your gas or diesel bus in the backup. 1 or 2, it's not that big deal. It won't affect your operations. But when you get into larger amount of buses, when you get into that 30 range and the like, you're going to run into some issues with how to manage so many, the charging so many of these vehicles. So, for example, when you get up to the higher numbers, you might have different models. You might have the same models, but you might have different generations. You might have different routes taking place at each one, of course. Payload of passengers could be different, and even the driving habits of the drivers. And so what you have is, when the vehicles are coming back to the depot with all these different variables, you're finding that they're coming back at a different state of charge. And a different state of charge is going to give you a different rate of charge when they plug in. So you have to be, very careful with that and get it signed up right. The last thing I'd like to say about this is, and this is very, very tricky. We had a colleague who would tell us about, hey, we were promised a charge management system as part of the transit bus, but we didn't get it. We still haven't gotten it yet. And so they're kind of running through some pain and some difficulties there. So be sure to keep track of that and stay on top of it and make sure you get what you're promised. Second thing, standards versus interoperability. Generally speaking, we are very big fans of open standards. Certainly reduces the risk of committing to one vendor, and if they go out of business, well, you get burnt because you're leaving stranded assets out there. But we've seen standards not really always mean interoperability, and what that means is you have some different equipment. They meet the same standards, but one might not work with the other. And the reason that is even though these different standards are published and sought after, some of the language in these standards are, well, the standard should meet this specification, or the standard may meet this specification. And again, getting back to the result of, hey, this equipment meets the standard, or this vehicle meets the standard, but the things just aren't working. And we've seen that again when you're trying to match up between 2 different vendors or even the same vendor and it's Gen 1, Gen 2. Or even one of our colleagues said, well, I had a charger that was working great on a vehicle battery that's 80 kilowatt hours. But when we went ahead and put that same charger into a compatible vehicle that had a 350 kilowatt hour battery, it didn't understand it. Problems took place, and it didn't work. So definitely make sure if somebody is saying, hey, this meets certain standards, well, has it actually been certified? Has it been tested? Do you know it? We actually came across, this was just for some communication network software for some residential EVSEs. But what I liked when one of the vendors replied to our RFP, it was great. They said, hey, our EVSEs meet OCPP standards, but here are all the different EVSEs that have been tested and proven. You kind of want those assurances to make you feel a little bit better and avoid any heartache down the road. Lessons learned on range anxiety. Now, range anxiety is typically a term used for consumers, but fleet managers out there are actually feeling range anxiety as well. And our suggestion is you really need to remain very conservative when you match a vehicle's expected or claimed range to what your operations are. Personally, I was given a Chevy Bolt all-electric vehicle, 230 miles of range. And yes, it was 239 miles of all-electric range when I got it during the spring, where the weather is really good, and down in where I live, there's flat roads and the like. But then when you got into winter and you drove on the highway going 70, maybe just a little bit more than 70 miles an hour, we didn't get 230 miles of range, a real big difference. And you don't want that to be a point where, okay, I just won't run my heater. That's not good. The other thing we heard out in the field was, well, that vendor's expectations or claims didn't match up to our real world. And I said, well, hold on, didn't you go ahead and do a pretty thorough telematics testing and kind of to demo the vehicles before you received them? He said, yeah, there was some extensive telematics, but this was interesting. He said, Jim, things change. Routes change. The mission of the organization change. And when you have a vehicle purchase that should last 15 years, you have to take that into consideration that, hey, things can change. And what you plan for early on in year 2 through 5 may not be 4 through 6. Lastly, on range anxiety, we found drivers vary widely. And you can train people as much as you want, but the range of one driver is certainly not the same as somebody else. And with liquid fuels, that's not as a big a deal. That just means pumping more gas or diesel. But with electricity, it is a bigger deal. That range anxiety is certainly exaggerated because the fueling time is much longer than just pumping it at the gas station. So, correct rates. You have to get with the correct rate, and I'm saying electric utility rates from the get-go. Came across a transit authority out west, and they deployed really more than 30 transit buses. And to be honest, from the get-go, they weren't on the right electric utility rate. And they didn't see the savings. It didn't meet their expectations. And they were a little upset because they said, well, gosh, now that this has become public and people are publishing, this experience and extra money, and we didn't get those savings that we were thinking, why didn't the electric utility educate us? And I think that's a fair question. And I think the way we can avoid these is, as Mike had said, engage your electric utility early and often. Now, the good news, they have, by working with their utility, they are seeing 25 to 30% savings. That's out West Coast prices. I can tell you that Duke Energy, we, with several of our customers, some of these early adopters, we are looking at the various rates, and they are significantly different. So rates are complicated. Get with the utility, and they're very complicated. I would get my specialist on it, and we'll run several reports for you and find out what the best rate is. So, you know, what are some of these lessons here? Yeah, take the plunge, jump in, but look first. It's funny when you're talking to fleet managers, they are very, very helpful with their information. And I've been on a call for 45 minutes and hearing complaints. I was like, gosh, is this really bad? And then they say, oh, no, of course, we actually want to buy more electric school buses. And then they go through all the different reasons why these buses are so good. But what they do say is, gosh, we wish we had just done a little bit more planning, and we wish maybe our vendors had been a little supportive. So do a lot of communication. Also realize this transition to really something that's better, electric transportation, it is a learning process. So don't expect that you can switch over magically, you know, very, very quickly. Understand that there really is you can hear presentations on how things are working within your region, across the state, nationally. But what is going to work for your operations requires some learning, not a flip of the switch. Trusted vendors are essential, as we had mentioned, and again, engage utility early and often is, I think, what we've kind of come across throughout both presentations. And that is what I have, and looking forward to heading to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was good. Both Mike and Jim appreciate all of that information. And I guess jumping right to a question received from a panelist, and then I've got a few others as well, or excuse me, from an attendee question we had. And it's two questions, but they do go together. How much additional generating capacity would be needed for an all-electric fleet, and how fast can the electric infrastructure scale up to support a 100% electric fleet? What is a reasonable target here? And so there's sort of a macro question and then, you know, a specific. So maybe, Mike, would you mind taking a stab at that, and feel free to throw out some assumptions maybe of a size of that fleet that we're talking about as you think of it.
Okay, be glad to. And obviously one of the quick questions is, depends on what you mean by an all-electric fleet. Is that one customer's fleet or all the vehicle fleet in the country? It's interesting, a number of years ago, a study was done that said with perfect charging, and again, a lot of this, the answer is obviously it depends on when the charging is done and things like that. One study a number of years ago looked at it and said if perfect charging was done, which is obviously impossible, but if perfect charging was done, that 70% of the vehicles in the country could be electrified with no additional capacity. Obviously, that's one bookend that's unrealistic. The other bookend is all of them charge at the same time, everywhere, and then obviously a lot of capacity would be needed, and that's unrealistic. So obviously the truth is somewhere in the middle, but how charging is done is the biggest question. And with the fleets that we've been talking about, the most common scenario is that the vehicles are charged at night off peak. Delivery trucks run through the day, and then they come back to a depot and they charge at night. In that scenario, it really doesn't add much generation capacity requirements because it is in an off-peak time. But as things scale up, obviously you're going to get some overlap. So the best way I know of answering this is when you think about the pace of electrification, it is very much within what utilities do. If you think about it, whether it was kitchen electrification after World War II, where everybody got electrified kitchens, or then you had in the 60s and 70s everybody adding central air conditioning, which really wasn't there beforehand. Then you had the data center environment, all the data centers that have been added. If you look at the increase in capacity needed for electric vehicles, it's in the same ballpark as those mass electrification things that have been done in the past. And so with the number of years that's expected, for this to ramp up, that the expectation is that adding that capacity shouldn't be an issue, with the appropriate caveats of policy and things like that. So I don't know if there's a target year for 100% electric fleet. We're starting to see these goals. California said beginning in 2035, I think it was, no liquid fuels would be sold. Even at that, there's some additional time for the fleet to turn over. So you're looking at probably in the years 2040 to 2050 before a substantial portion of the fleet would be electric. But at the same time, as we look at fleets, it's not so much that macro capacity that's the question. In many cases, it'll be the localized capacity of a fleet that electrifies. Do we need to upgrade facilities to create more local capacity from a distribution and transmission standpoint?
And quickly, Mike, just to follow up on this, you mentioned it, both of you actually mentioned it, that, you want to look at duty cycle, you want to look at the right fit of a technology and fuel for what you're trying to do. And you may not have an answer for this, but has there been a look at the entire country's vehicle situation and said, well, are 100% of those vehicles really right for electrification, or is it some lesser portion? I'm guessing it's the latter, but has any analysis been done on that as to what's realistic? It's one thing to say, hey, everything goes electric, this is what it's going to take, but is there a kind of a realistic number of what would likely go electric? And do you have that number?
Well, I don't have that number, because it obviously, again, it depends, and different people have different things. There's really, with the vehicles available today, what percentage? Today driving cross country in a semi truck is really not going to be reasonable. But how soon will, what happens to battery prices? What happens to battery density? What is there a big breakthrough in batteries that dramatically lowers the cost and increases the energy density? So I think it's too early to tell. All you can pretty much say is at any given time, what can be electrified, and that is growing, daily. As improvements to batteries come, as new vehicles come on the road, as costs come down. But I don't know a specific number, because it's all dependent on the technology.
No, it was a bit of an unfair question to spring on you, so that is a fair answer for sure. There is a lot of change going on at this time. So maybe real quick for Jim, a couple quick hitters that we've received for you. First, to EVs potentially providing power back to the grid, so vehicle-to-grid applications. Do you have any local examples of this being looked into or deployed?
Well, we don't have local examples that we can, I believe, talk about it at this point, but we do have several folks that are looking into it. And I'm just not sure if that is something that we can release at this point. That might be, the V2G might be a better question for Mike, because I believe Mike is working on some of this.
Yeah, Jim pretty much hit it. We do have some initial V2G requests. They are more of the exploratory stage, both in the Carolinas and the Midwest. So the inquiry, it is technically possible, technically achievable with no doubt, but still questions on the, does it make sense from a market standpoint? But we do have some early requests for exploring that. So I don't feel comfortable mentioning specific names, but it is starting to get more attention.
Very good. So stay tuned is the takeaway. so yeah.
And the good news, the big thing there is Mike said it's possible. today. It's technically feasible. The question is when does it make financial sense, and then also catching up with rates and other things. So good things to come.
And that's good information. I guess, and I do see a couple more comments from folks as well that, V2G interest is growing in the school bus market due to California funding. So there's certainly, as you all pointed out, it's where and when and so forth. A lot of the local realities make a difference. Real another quick hitter for you, Jim, and then I've got a question for Mike. But Jim, does Duke have a specific EV charging rate that defers any demand rate charges? And I guess we're speaking specifically in the Carolinas, and then if you want to further talk about anything that might relate to medium heavy duty fleet situations, that'd be good.
Yeah, Duke Energy has different rates. We don't have, let's say, a specific EV tariff or EV rate. What we do have in different jurisdictions is regular rates compared to a peak demand rate. That does have those implications. With that peak demand rate, if you charge an off-peak, you have a much lower rate. So in that commercial and medium-duty, heavy-duty market, those rates are available.
Great, thank you. Mike, I've got a question about Republic Services in Hickory, North Carolina just received a Mack EV refuse truck for testing. Can you talk about, and if you need to throw it to Jim or we can follow up later, that's fine, but what arrangements had to be made at the user's location in order to make this test successful? And by the way, if you don't know the specifics even more generically, what you would suspect had to occur, that would be fine to hear about as well.
Okay, well, I was about to say, Dave, we need to talk afterwards because I wasn't aware that they had received that one. So I don't think we did anything in advance. So that is an example. It's fairly straightforward in this case. I'm aware of the Mack EV refuse truck, so likely it had a DC fast charger, probably relatively low, probably a 50 kW DC fast charger would be my guess, or potentially even level 2. So getting one truck really is probably not going to change much at their facility. But the question then is, all right, what if they changed all their refuse trucks to EV? And that's where things start getting critical. So generally you can do a 1 or 2 vehicle pilot with very minimal impact locally or with the utility. But it's important, all right, getting the data from that, understanding what are the power requirements, so that as you move from the pilot to scale, what needs to happen. So, Dave, we can follow up later and maybe get a connection so we can do a little investigation there. It'd be good to see get some feedback on that early deployment.
Very good. So Mike, and this actually could go to both of you, Mike and Jim. We've just heard from you, very good overview. Electricity as a fuel brings a whole set of questions and considerations for fleet managers. You provided a lot of ideas. Do you have any top recommendations for where a fleet manager should start in order to learn more about infrastructure? So again, you both emphasize speak with your utility early and often. A lot of good advice, but is there some specific recommendations? First thing you get back to the office Monday, what should you be getting into to learn more about infrastructure?
Yeah, I can answer that. If you have an interest in exploring electricity as a transportation fuel for you, you can contact me. You can, and hopefully we can make my email and phone number available. But if you're within any of the jurisdictions, I'm the primary liaison for fleet operations, whether that's light duty or medium duty or heavy duty. And certainly I can bring all the resources, which would include Mike Rowan, to the table, and we can help out. We'd love to help you with that assessment. And for us, it's not, hey, let's sell this to try to get you to switch. It's hey, let's do some analysis with you to see if it makes sense and when it makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Did you have anything to add, Mike?
Now, obviously, reach out to us. There's also, I mentioned the EI resources earlier. There's also some industry groups that have information. There's a lot of information out there. As you start trying to understand what vehicles are available. But one of the reasons we're doing this at Duke is to make it where it's easy to reach out to us, and we can help you get started on that journey. But I would say if a fleet is part of a industry organization or something like that, there's also a lot of them are bringing additional data to making more data available.
Okay, well, thank you both, and it's good news. Bad news is I actually didn't get to many of the questions I had, but thank you to our audience for providing so many. In fact, there were a few others we didn't even get to. So as I mentioned at the top, we will try to wrap things up in a summary and provide some good information and follow-up information, including our panelists' contact information, as Jim just mentioned, and so forth. So thank you all for being here. Thank you really to the participants and panelists that have helped over the last several months through this entire series. We feel like a lot of great information has been brought to the Carolinas as part of this, and again, appreciate Mike Rowan and Jim Polk with Duke Energy, and of course Jacob. Always a pleasure to work with you, and really appreciate